Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Science Dispatch Podcast. My name is Cameron English. That handsome young man over there is Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. Chuck, what's going on?
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful day, especially since this is the first time I've sat down in front of the computer. The rest of the time I've spent out in the garage playing around with pieces of wood. So I'm a very happy camper today. Very happy.
Okay. Playing with wood in the garage can be fun, though. There's certain around the home projects that I'm starting to enjoy. Maybe you were listening to the Beatles, as we were just talking about. New music is, cats banging on pots and pans, and the good stuff is old, right? I was just saying I'm becoming my father when I'm yelling about the kids.
Well, my good stuff is even older, so this is the problem.
I think it's backwards evolution, though. Like the further back in time you go, the better the music gets. That's my working hypothesis. I'm sure.
Okay.
Sure, somebody's looked into that. Anyways, we're here to discuss a story. This is going to be a tough one for a lot of people. It was tough for a lot of the readers. A lot of the comments that we received on this one, both both internally and publicly.
Oh yes, because there was a lot of talk at the bunker about this article.
Yeah, I dare say this one, strangely, in my opinion, was more controversial than the article advocating that pain patients be allowed to kill themselves. just to give you a sense of scale. So this is a piece I wrote a little over a week ago. This is called "Science Subsidy Trap: Why Public Research Funding Needs to End." Pause for dramatic effect. Okay, so let me read this introduction, and then I'll break down the story a little bit, Chuck, and then. I know you have a little bit of a different perspective, maybe a lot of bit of a different perspective, but what I appreciate about you is you'll actually come here and talk about it. And,
I felt that this was, it had generated so much discussion that it was ripe for us sitting down and just going back and forth for a little while over it. Plus the beauty of role reversal, where I can just sit here and you can talk about the article for a little while.
Fair enough. You deserve a break today. All right. So here's the brief summary at the top. The U.S. government spends over $160 billion annually on scientific research. This massive expense is marketed to taxpayers as an investment in groundbreaking research that fuels innovation and discovery. In truth, much of the federal science budget is expended on questionable and even fraudulent research. It's time we eliminate it. Okay. So as I light my Molotov cocktail, Chuck, I'm following the news as most people are, and the big story in science media, in the science community, is that the presidential administration is gutting every federal agency. They're firing hundreds, maybe thousands of people in some cases. They are freezing grants. They're refusing to renew grants. They are trying to take back money that was already promised. The handling of this has been sort of a bull in a china shop. And so the reaction from the science community predictably has been, hey, what the hell, man, is what it is, right? And I sympathize with that, despite what I'm about to say. If you read any major science publication like Science or Nature or Scientific American, or like any magazine or outlet within that sort of milieu, the message typically, and this is a quote from Scientific American, is that the administration's policies, quote, imperil the nation's health, economy, and national security. And this is all stemming from the argument that when we invest in scientific research, innovation comes out of it, private companies come along and they chaperone these new drugs, for example, through the FDA review process, and then everyone has access to more medicine and the world is better off as a result. So what I'm doing in the story is I'm challenging that framework because I think it's actually not nearly as sound as people assume. So I go through a couple of things. The first two are negative, and I'm talking about the widespread fraud in science, which we've talked a little bit about here. And then I talk about a term that I borrowed from Roger Pilkey Jr., who's a science policy expert. And he calls this tactical science, where you have academic research that's being funded not because it's useful information or it's producing, a product that has lots of utility, but because there's a particular political goal in mind that the people that fund this work want to support. And that's what you're seeing. So I give a couple examples of that. And then I talk about how the private alternative is just either companies or foundations or maybe even individuals funding scientific research, even at the basic level, and how that worked quite well. So I'm not going to recapitulate the whole article, but just to give a couple of examples. When you're talking about fraud, I think everyone knows these. We're talking about major institutions like the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute at Harvard University, having to retract 7 studies last year because there were, I think it was anonymous scientists on websites like PubPeer who looked through the papers and they said, hey, there's fabricated images. There's duplicated images in these studies, which amounts to fake data. That's a big deal. A lot of their work is funded by the National Institutes of Health. Probably the bigger story was from last fall. You had the head of the National Institute on Aging, which has a budget of over $2.5 billion, identified for duplicating images in some key studies that were used to justify clinical trials of drugs for Parkinson's disease. Now, I don't know what the outcome of those trials are going to be, but from what we're looking at here, this is a very serious case of fraud that is going to cost over $1 billion when it's all said and done. On the tactical science front, we've talked a lot about these examples. There was that infamous case from, I think, last year where you had a climate scientist saying, I published a study in Nature Climate Change, I think it was, about how climate change is driving wildfires. And he says, I deliberately excluded data that would implicate any other cause because that's what the journalists want to hear about, is that climate change is accelerating wildfires. There's cases from infectious disease and pediatrics. There's one really incredible example that maybe we can talk about more if you want, but there's a case of Health and Human Services before Kennedy took over, downplaying a lot of the evidence related to pediatric gender care, which is just, whatever the topic, the fact that was going on, that sort of dishonesty is troublesome. And then a couple other examples of this, you have a lot of the studies we debunk, Chuck, excuse me. Like I can call you Chunk if you want.
But that's why I've been taking the Ozempic, so we don't have to call me Chunk. Thank you, though.
Chunk is no longer a chubhead, as he said last week. Okay, a lot of the research that websites like ACSH tackle are these bunk associational studies. Chuck's written a lot about these. You call a lot of this research math magic because there's all kinds of cool statistical footwork you can do to draw all kinds of correlations. Whether or not they're actually real is another story. But we're talking about examples of ultra-processed food linked to early death, food dyes, which are a big one, being associated with ADHD, PFAS chemicals harming infants, BPA causing endocrine disruption, tampons exposing women to lead, sugar is addictive, like we talked about on a recent episode. So my point here is that a bunch of this research, including those examples I cited, they're all federally funded. And they don't serve any purpose except to enable environmental groups or public health NGOs that file lawsuits and they promote scare stories and then they raise money on those. That's the benefit of that research. Now, a lot of people in science today will criticize figures like RFK Jr. for promoting this, but they will rarely say, well, he's quoting NIH-funded science in a major academic journal, right? So they don't want to talk about that part. They don't want to talk about this decade's worth of questionable work that really fueled the message that he now has a platform to amplify. And so those are the kind of issues that I'm talking about. And I think the best way to deal with this is to just cut off the spigot. Just don't fund this work. And I'm sure we'll have lots of objections that maybe you can bring up some of them, Chuck. I'm sure you know most of them that will come in response to this. But let's talk a little bit in a few minutes. I'll stop here and let you jump in.
Okay, so I'm going to spot you a few points right away. Is there fraud? Yes. Is there reproducibility problems? Yes. But I don't think we can say clearly it's all government funded. I think that some of this is in the private sector, and a lot of the misleading science is science that is, as they say, left in the file drawer. It's a negative study that never makes it to light because the funding source doesn't want it to be there. So I come from a different position saying all those things you said are true, but there's really not a great deal of evidence that private funding will do a better job at that than government funding. So that's statement one. Statement two is I'm going to separate out the bull in the china shop approach of, once again, move quickly, break things, apologize another year, that the administration is following, and really kind of zero in on this private versus public funding. And when I went back to look at things, it becomes unclear to me what the right answer is when doing that. There's a study, and I guess we can link to it in the podcast notes, in JAMA, looking at the spending by NIH on new drug approvals. And they spent as much as the pharmaceutical companies in getting those drugs across the finish line. And so I don't think we can just say out of hand the government funding isn't productive. So there's that. And then the other place where I think we can have a little bit more give and take is over this argument about targeted strategic science, which I think is true. Absolutely. But there's also an element of strategic targeted science that says you write the grant proposal to make the funding source happy. And if you can include phrases that they want to hear, that makes it all the better. And I think we're seeing the downside of that as the Biden administration liked the terms diversity, inclusion, and equity, irrespective of what you were talking about. And the Trump administration says if we find those words in there, we'll take it out. The study's over. So, I think that there's a big group of people that target their research based on what they can get funded, and that that's equally a part of the problem. And that there's no guarantee that I see that private funding will do a better job than public funding. It's in your court.
Very, very good points. I wanted to find a humorous example of that sort of thing where the language included in these articles is, okay, here's an example. This is the New England Journal of Medicine. This is a study they published in November 2022. This is about mask mandates in public schools. So they're making the case that mandates actually improved infection rates in the districts that kept them versus the districts that did, which is a perfectly valid question that needs to be explored. So the authors didn't just say, this is a good idea for thus and so epidemiological arguments. They said the policy is good because the effects of COVID-19, quote, have been disproportionately borne by groups already made vulnerable by historical and contemporary systems of oppression, including structural racism and settler colonialism. In an epidemiological paper about masking. Okay? Yes.
Absolutely. So, and they're an easier example to find, but I think, when you start talking about some of, Secretary Kennedy's work in the past and the work that they funded, it's the same kind of verbiage and targeted. If I want to get a grant from them, I'm going to be talking about autism this month because that's, now that we're going to have an answer for autism, it's been moved from 6 months to a year, but I'll still be pretty excited to see the answer in that time frame. That's where all the grant money, the grant money is going to be sitting there, and people are going to write it up, mass mandates as it affects autistic children. You can count on it if they're not already there.
So a couple of things. I don't want to get too sidetracked on this because I take your point that they're framing their grant proposals in a way that's going to, tickle the ears of the people that are saying yes or no. I totally get that. That's just sales. Everyone has to do that. Like when we want to get someone on this podcast, we talk about, and we mean it, right? We like your work. This article you wrote was great. Come talk about it. That's just typical, business communication. Nevertheless, what I question is when you're willing to insert this entire ideological framework into your study, it makes me doubt that you're going to be honest with your data in some cases, right?
Again,
So if you're willing to attach this whole alternative history, frankly, in many cases about settler colonialism into a story, into a study about an associational link between masking and reduced infection rates, it makes me doubt that you're being honest with your data because you're willing to sign off on a lot of BS, a lot of ideological nonsense to please your funders. And I've been told my entire career, as I'm sure you have as well, that in science, we test our hypotheses. We're looking for the null result. We're the junk science judo choppers. We're going to follow the evidence, right? And in reality, what you're telling me now is that, well, it depends, right? If I can grease the skids by putting the right verbiage in my grant, well, you know what I mean?
But that's equally true if I'm asking for a grant from HHS or from the Koch brothers. That's my only point, is that there's no guarantee. I think that all the problems that you raised at the beginning of the article are valid and need to be addressed. But again, where's the overwhelming evidence that this is primarily a public health funding or public funding difficulty? And which also gets to another point I want to raise, which is probably too theoretical to it, is that the question is, how do you spur innovation? Do you spur innovation by direct applications, or do you spur innovation by allowing people to do basic science? And I think that the government probably funds a lot more basic science because they don't have to do a quarterly ROI on the projects that they're doing, so that they may set the stage for the innovation. That old idea that you stand on the shoulders of the people that came before you. Without that basic science, you're not going to necessarily get the application science that you want. And again, who's going to fund that?
Yeah, all good questions. That model you're talking, by the way, that's called the pipeline model. The idea is that the NIH and other public institutions fund the risky, unknown research that could fail spectacularly, and by subsidizing that, they get to the useful information, right? They discover the new molecule that becomes a new drug for insert major condition, and then pharma comes along and invests in the commercialization. They have the funds to get it through the FDA ringer to get the green light for it actually to hit the market. So that's the model. I want to address these as fairly as I can because I know we don't have too much time. Let's start with this though. Where is Elizabeth Holmes right now, the founder of Theranos?
She's actually with the federal government now, serving time.
Right. Yeah. The answer is in federal prison. Now, I don't mean that as a gotcha, but what I mean is in the market, if you defraud your investors, as she did, claiming that she had a product that did all these great things that actually did no such thing, there were consequences. She's in jail now. Not
in jail for research fraud. She's in jail for financial fraud.
Right, but it was a science company.
Yes,
right?
It was.
Okay, right. So she was telling her investors that she had a great product. Okay, that's my point though. In the private sector, not that it's perfect, pharma does a lot of evil stuff. I'm not gonna deny that. The examples are myriad, no doubt about it. But she's in prison, right? There were consequences. Now, the guy at the National Institute of Aging, I think he was put on administrative leave, but he's not going to go to federal prison. Anyone at Dana-Farber, that case is still ongoing. All the details have not been revealed, but there's no federal time for them. The other classic, Neil Potty, I think was his name, at Duke University, faked clinical trial data in cancer research. I think he was fired, but there's no consequences. So you see what I'm getting at here, right? There are thousands of retracted studies each year. Some of them are very significant. Almost all of them get some sort of public support. And the consequences, and this is a comment from Dr. David Zarek, who writes a lot about these sorts of issues, who was fired from his university a couple years ago for asking certain questions he wasn't supposed to. But the point is like there's very little consequence in the public sector, as far as I can tell, and that's one of the major differences, I think, is that if you're in the private sector, the risk of consequence is much higher, which is going to suppress the fraud to a certain extent. That's an important point. The second thing is that, hold on, and one other thing, and then I'll stop. There are studies that are buried, right? Like if a clinical trial doesn't give you the results that you want, you might just put it in the file drawer. Okay, that does happen. But in the United States, at least, if you don't submit good clinical data to the FDA, they'll say no, and you can't sell the drug. End of story, right? So a couple of things. I'm not required to fund those studies as a taxpayer. When it comes to the public side of the ledger, though, I am. And in fact, if you even ask where your money's going, as I have discovered over the last week and a half, well, you don't have an advanced degree and you're a dipshit and you don't understand logic. And, you know what I mean? So this is what I'm getting at, right? It's like, if Pfizer engages in fraud, they'll get sued to death, right? Like pharma companies get sued even when they don't do anything wrong, or talc and all these other things that we could talk about. So that's all I'm getting at, right? There's the incentives are different and the consequences are different as a result of that. Your thoughts?
Fair, once again, fair. See, I think that it's very hard to punish a corporation for its bad deeds. There's no corporate timeout. Let's take one that's been a really bad player, Boeing. Okay, I think we can all agree that there's some problems there in the safety concerns that Boeing has had, that we have evidence of things falling out of the sky that should be staying in the air.
Yeah, used as intended, not good for your health.
So there's no one going to prison. There has been some fines which are then passed along to us to pay, and there's no timeout. It's not like, okay, Boeing, you can't, make planes for us for the next 10 years. There's even less sometimes punishment or correction for corporate malfeasance as there may be for individuals. And certainly within the corporations, it's oftentimes difficult to say who the corporate person was that's going to be held responsible. So I think, again, all of the things you say are true, but it's not clear to me that saying make everything public will improve the situations and may cause some other downstream concerns. So,
Yes, I agree with you 100%. I find companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin really disturbing. Their business models are curious, let's say. But what I would add, importantly, is that Boeing has two divisions, right? They have a commercial airliner side of their business. The much bigger side of the business is military contractor, right? So the products that I think most people find troublesome or should find troublesome are the products that are designed to blow up small children who've done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong country at the wrong time. So in other words, their business, and since money is fungible, as you said on a recent episode, their business is heavily subsidized by a federal government that sees value. See, I'm going to get everyone mad at me on this episode, right?
Yes.
Everyone's going to be mad. Their business is subsidized by the Department of Defense primarily, and by a lot of our foreign governments that we are allied with. So again, this sort of goes back to my point, though, which is we have a government that is heavily lobbied and influenced by entities that benefit from the largesse that they get in return for that.
True. Part of the when you talk about Boeing, now we're starting to talk about monopolistic practices. Certainly we could all agree that it's probably best to have our fighter jets made in the U.S. I think not going to be any real issues with that. They're the only ones left. They're the only ones left making it. The other company that we can talk to, unless you're going to see if you can get them from China at a discount from Temu, is Airbus. And so there's other ways that that's the kind of thing that makes me concerned. If you talk about turning all of research over to corporations, they have their own agendas, and they have shareholders or stockholders that need to see that there's a return on their investment. And so they're going to be more disinclined to fund things that do not have any short-term value to them. And I think that that's problematic. Do I think that some of these other studies need to go? Absolutely. But that would require actually somebody to be thoughtful and say, these are the things that we're interested in funding, and we never have those debates.
Yeah, well, and that's a good subject to turn to, because the other one with subsidizing military contractors is messy. But I get into this a little in the article. It's interesting. A lot of the case for public science funding came from this idea during the Cold War that we were falling behind, right? We needed to invest heavily. And as I think you're sort of alluding to right now, that was the true motivation, right? Is that there were people that stand to gain from that investment in basic science, we'll call it, right? You know, a lot of Japanese people enjoyed the blessings of basic science.
I'll use the word enjoyed, but okay.
Well, a little suntan, you know.
Oh, God, no.
No, let's get real, right? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people being killed. Anyways, it's a long rabbit trail. To your point about fraud and dealing with fraud. The problem I have is that you and I and a few other people that I'm engaging with publicly about this are the only ones talking about scientific fraud and politics influencing academic research, because nobody will talk about it in this context. So 2 years ago, for example, you know, you would see an article in Science about the work that Elizabeth Bick was doing as a data sleuth, going through these really technical papers and finding where they had, you know, the Western blot was faked or something, like, you know what I mean? So people will talk about this. They'll talk about what a problem it is. We never get around to a solution though, right? And now that everyone in the science community is saying things, and this is a direct quote from a sign I saw at one of these protests, science keeps you a-holes alive, right? That's the message that the public is getting. So someone in science needs to hire a PR consultant. So they, you know what I mean? So like you're not you, but the people in science have said, we have a fraud problem. There's a team at Northwestern University who I quote in the article. They said, this is an existential crisis. We have over 50% of the research in biomedicine is not replicating. That's enormous. That's a serious problem. People will talk about that, but when it comes to, okay, let's cut significant amounts of funding from the fields that are producing this junk work that doesn't go anywhere. How dare you? How dare you even question? You know what I mean?
Okay.
So let me put it this way, and then I'll let you jump all over me. People will acknowledge the problem, but they won't actually do anything about it, and that's the issue. So like now that I've brought this up, people are responding to me and saying, well, the answer is to address the fraud. I'm like, well, the answer 30 years ago was to address the fraud, and no one did. So here we are. That's
all fair, but you know, so I'm a big fan of this. You know, 1-to-1. If you've committed research fraud, you have a permanent timeout from funding from the federal government. Keep in touch. You're done. You need to do that a few times, and that'll start to disappear very quickly. You're correct that when there's no consequences, people tend to do what they want, and I think that it does need to be addressed. Again, you know, and we can go back to I keep going back to the same point. I'm going to end on this note. I think we science is too expensive to be solely funded in the private sector. It's very expensive to have yourself, you know, your own linear accelerator. We got to share on some of these things. So I think that in some areas, you know, a public-private collaboration remains the way to go. The other place, if we want to look historically, and I don't know ultimately how that goes, is the early scientists were all funded privately by various wealthy people who were the philanthropists of their day. And so there's certainly a place for that. I just don't know whether I want Jeff Bezos determining because he's so wealthy and he can splash money around what our research priorities should or should not be. You know, if you want to get back to Elon, I think it's a great idea if he wants to go to Mars, but I don't think the rest of us are going for a while. So maybe we could work on more practical problems back here.
So the question then, and again, we won't go too much longer here because we've already gone longer than we normally do. Is it a better alternative for Chuck Schumer and Donald Trump to have Chuck just literally shook in his chair?
No. Well, no. Neither one of them is prepared to do anything useful in science. Political science or regular science. Either one.
Well, this is, I didn't include this in the article because it was getting too long, but, I think this is an interesting point in that the science community, one of their retorts to the administration right now is, you are censoring us. You are telling us that we have to do certain kinds of work. And in a way, what they're doing is they're addressing my point. And I'm saying, yes, this is the result of having a political establishment dictating what kind of work gets funded, right? So if you go find an NGO, you go find a foundation, or you go find crowd fund your research, right? If it's that valuable, if it's that essential, you should be able to find money for it. So then the Trump administration can't tell you to take DEI language out of your grants or out of your studies.
It's not simply political. For instance, the amyloid hypothesis has driven Alzheimer's research for 30 years now. It may not be the right answer. We may have spent 30 years barking up the wrong molecule. And, there's that to be said too. There is a complex of experts that drive their fields. You can't, if you want to study atherosclerosis, you're not going to start by saying, I think it's caused by dengue fever. You're not going to get any grant money to look in that. It's, coronary artery disease is atherosclerosis until proven otherwise. It's the same problem, we have when we talk about ulcers. Ulcer disease was treated surgically because there was no other option until somebody did a study and discovered, oh no, it's caused by bacteria.
And interestingly, he just swallowed the bacteria to prove his thesis because nobody believed him. Interestingly, right? The academy said, and the surgical community, from what I understand, from an article from Jeff Singer, who's also a surgeon, everyone was like, "Yeah, whatever, dude. You don't know, right?" And he's like, "Watch this. Hold my beer."
Well, first of all, I had to take 3 chapters out of my book and throw them away. And just as the fun fact of the day, this weekend is Theodore Bill Roth's birthday. Now, Bill Roth is probably somebody that doesn't come off immediately to your frame of mind, but he was the one that invented nearly all of the stomach operations. So that's why he has 2 chapters.
I actually have his poster on my wall over here. I don't know.
He has 2 chapters and 2 different operations, the Bill Roth 1 and, of course, the Bill Roth 2.
Classic operations. Okay, let's wrap up here. Clearly, this is not going to be settled. I appreciate Chuck being willing to spar with me a little bit. Most people just called me an idiot, so that's good. As we wrap up here, one of the books that I borrowed from heavily was published in 1996, but as background content, it's very helpful. It's called The Economic Laws of Scientific Research by Terence Keeley, who is a biochemist. And I think he convincingly addresses a lot of these issues. And one of the things he talks about historically is that innovation primarily came from people working in industrial settings who were tired of all the manual labor, right? So so you know what I mean? And especially in textiles, that's where a lot of it started, is you had innovations that allowed people to reduce the amount of physical labor they had to exert. And this actually drove the search for more innovation, right? So in other words, you got the technology first, and then that yielded the interest and the funding from the private sector for basic research, because they realized if you just let people tinker, they might actually find something useful, right? And then throughout the scientific revolution, there's very little public funding. I mean, the work of Darwin, Kepler, all of these guys, there was no NIH funding their work. And so just something to consider, you're a reader, maybe you'll like to read that book. But all I'll say as we close, I think this is not as simple of an issue, right? People would respond to the article and they would go, well, we have modern medicine because of public funding. And so you're stupid and you want people to die. It's like, oh, well, not really. That's not my goal. But in any case, I guess we can leave it there. Thank you, Chuck, for your insights. Any final thoughts?
No, I'm pretty well shot now. I gotta
go. Chuck's going to go play with his grandkids and forget about this, and I don't blame him one bit for that. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for listening, everyone. Follow us on social media. It's at ACSH.org. I'm at CamJ English. The website is acsh.org. Click the subscribe tab. Give us your email. We'll send you the stories, even the fringe ones that I write that are controversial. And the ones you read are the ones we talk about. Thank you so much, as always, and we'll see you next time.